"Are you ready?" Jay asked. My head rested against Jay's crossed ankles, eyes staring up at the sky beyond her head. It was a gorgeous day. Crystal blue skies and wisps of white cotton clouds danced past the tops of the trees straight above me. It was actually warm for the first time in a long time. Everyone around me in the circle seemed lit in soft fire as the afternoon sunlight broke through the pine trees and scattered like liquid gold to the forest floor beneath. I took it all in for a second, then sucked in a breath and shut my eyes. Ready. 7 doors. 7 doors. 7 doors. I was nervous. I had no idea how I was ever going to relax enough to slip into that altered state I'd become so familiar with at this point. But suddenly, it was happening. I sank, my vision receding into darkness, and the voice of the girl seemed to come from far away, as if I had dropped underwater. I shivered, and when I faintly heard Jay ask, "What do you see?" I opened my eyes. I was in a huge, expansive field. The sky, the tall grass that brushed against my jeans, and the few small birds in the sky, all were gray, like I had stepped into an old black and white movie. All color leached from everything, including, as I looked down at myself, me. And when I raised my eyes, I nearly jumped. A sharp gasp escaped my lips, and from very, very far away, I could hear Jay's voice. "What is it?" "I'm surrounded," I whispered. "They're all around me." They stood on 4 legs, soft sable fur glimmering in the dull gray light. Bristling antlers tower towards the sky, ending in wickedly sharp points, tipped dark with some unknown glimmering liquid. They looked like elk, but larger, and in the center of each velvety forehead opened a third eye, unblinking and staring. They surrounded me in a circle, and they were all staring at me. "Jay?" I whispered. "Jay, what do I do?" "Just move very slowly," she responded. "And don't piss them off, please. We got enough shit to worry about right now without adding to it." I took a few hesitant steps towards one edge of the circle. The elk seemed disinclined to move, but as I approached, almost touching one of them, it shifted to the side slowly to allow me to pass. The circle closed behind me, and I could feel the weight of their enormous bodies, antlers clicking as they tapped against one another, moving in unison. Ahead, in the distance, I could see the tree line of a forest, and before that tree line, a huge building towered, with rows of smaller trees laid out across its front lawn like a small orchard. It reminded me of those plantation houses in the South, elaborate and impressive in its physicality, but also wilting, with crumbling shingles and dark moss claiming the corners of ceilings and the base of columns. In the background, I started to hear a low, almost imperceptible noise, the low rumbling of a far-off earthquake, and a softer, choppier noise layered over the top. I described it all to Jay as I began walking forward through the tall grass, the mansion looming up ahead of me. The low, rumbling sound encroached on the edge of my hearing. It was always there, subversive, and barely loud enough to pick up. But for some reason, the hairs had been standing up on my arms the moment I opened my eyes in the field. As I finished describing the scene for the others, I heard a faint sound coming from the building ahead of me. It sounded like a phrase, like someone was repeating something over and over. But at the end of the jumble of words, I could distinctly make out one syllable. cat. Fuck. Guys? I whispered. I think I hear Elia's voice. I took off in a light jog, booking it through the high grass that slapped against my legs as I ran. Surprisingly, the herd of elk followed. They kept a medium distance behind me, but they moved like a silent tide over the field, spreading out behind me in a wall of antlers and muscle. As I approached the house, they fell back, marking a line about 50 feet from the front entrance with their bodies. They fell still, silently watching me as I approached the huge front porch. The windows were dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the faded, cracked panes of glass. No sign or indication of what lay inside, waiting for me. The voice was a little stronger, yet I still struggled to make out the entire phrase. I simply heard a jumble of words, followed by cat, repeated over and over, in a discordant sing-song melody. Now that I was closer, I was even more certain that it sounded like Elia. "There's nothing on the porch," I whispered. "It's bare. No furniture. Nothing." As I approached the door, I balked. The front door loomed dark and heavy against the white wooden building, and I knew immediately that it was the at once familiar and dreaded black door. Yet, something about it had changed. I swallowed and stepped forward cautiously, the porch creaking softly under my weight. The large symbol in the middle of the door was different from what Lorraine and Elia had described. There was still a circle, a long horizontal line and 2 lines beneath it, but where the third and lowest line had cut across the bottom of the circle, now it was replaced with a long outline of an ovid shape, with a solid circle at the center of that shape. And, as I looked, something dark stained the white wood wall next to the door. Maybe I was seeing things or recognizing a pattern where there wasn't any, but it looked like there was a handprint across the door frame, a dark central palm, with long, ragged-looking fingers stretching out, reaching in towards the doorknob. My eyes took it in, and that keening, rumbling noise at the edge of my hearing seemed to intensify, filling my eardrums. I found my right hand lifting, slowly, reaching out towards that handprint, my limbs shaking, my body shaking, my organs and my heart and my lungs rumbling and quivering and becoming that noise, until I heard nothing else and saw nothing else as I reached, palm desperately wanting to press into the blackness of its hand. Pain exploded on the side of my body, and I was launched sideways, sprawling over the porch, wrists and head slapping against the wood like a rag doll. One of the members of the elk herd had climbed the porch and stood towering over me, antlers shadowed against the gray sky beneath him. It stared down at me as I gasped for breath on the ground, ice in my lungs, and my head bursting with pain, and my ribs were bruised. Jay's voice seemed to whisper from far away. "What happened?" Fuck. Nothing. I just need to get out of here. Fast." The elk snorted at me, and I perceived a contemptuous note in its heavy breath, before it backed off the porch and stood in the grass in front of the mansion, watching me impassively. I scrambled to my feet and approached the door, keeping my eyes off the grotesque handprint and reaching for the doorknob. I noticed, with trepidation, the names of all my friends carved into the wood, and at the top of the circle, where Elia had claimed her name had been, I now saw the name Catherine. I opened the door. The mansion expanded around me, massive. The ceiling was as high as a cathedral, with arching points and angled apexes. Nothing at all like what it might have looked like from the outside. Everything was pale white, but there was an insidious darkness that hung heavy, coalescing in every nook and cranny, and settling as if waiting for me to do something. Because of the unique architecture, there were corners everywhere. Not just in the walls, but on the ceiling as it sloped and dipped, arched and folded, and met itself again in high peaks pointed up toward the sky and beyond. The massive space was decorated with strange furniture unidentifiable to me, and, again, there seemed to be extra edges to things, as if I were looking at one of those magic eye pictures where illusions pop out of flat surfaces. I had a headache immediately as my eyes tried to make sense of it all, and couldn't. There were 2 staircases lining the walls, leading up to a second-floor balcony, and dark hallways beyond. Ahead of me, at the far end of the large entryway, seemed to be a huge, looming structure. A structure that I felt an immediate aversion to. A sick, gut-deep revulsion shook through me every time my eyes tried to focus on it. It seemed a tangled mess of angles and shapes that moved with slow, undulating purpose out of the corner of my eye. Yet, when I grew close to looking at it, it went still. An indecipherable statue in an indecipherable room. At its base, hunched over in a curled ball, was someone that looked like Elia. Jay, I see Elia! Oh, Jesus, she's still in here. I kept my eyes on her form, refusing to look at the large structure she was huddled in front of any longer. I'm moving towards her. Maybe if I get her out of here, this whole thing will be over. A garbled whisper hissed in my ear. It sounded like Jay, but it was as if she was talking over a malfunctioning walkie-talkie, and I could only make out every other word. Careful, I heard through the static. Elia, I whispered sharply as I got closer. Elia, it's Kat! She was muttering to herself, unintelligible words interspersed with what sounded like my name. I inched closer towards her, fingers reaching out to grasp her shoulder. If I could just get her out of here, get back to the clearing, have Jay pull us out. My fingers touched her shoulder, just as her muttered words finally unjumbled and became clear. Curiosity killed the cat. She uncurled then, and turned to look back at me. It was Elia's face, but her eyes were fathomless, completely black. Not empty, but filled with a vastness and an unending void so deep that it terrified me. It felt like looking at a moonless night sky, but instead of standing grounded on my backyard patio, I had stepped out beyond the sky, beyond the stars and planets, as if everything recognizable and warm was behind me, and I was right on the edge of where only the blackness remained. I stared at it, and it stared right back. I snatched my hand back, as if I'd been burned, and she slowly stood up to face me. She kept repeating the phrase, Curiosity killed the cat. And as she straightened onto her feet, she cocked her head to the side, as if listening to something far off. But then, she kept going, her head bending further and further to the side, until I was sure her neck would snap. And it still kept going, turning around in a horrifyingly slow motion circle, those eyes staring at me, until her head had turned all the way around, and her chin pointed up towards the ceiling, while her long hair dangled down in front of her body. Her mouth opened wide, the sentient vastness of the abyss beyond the cavern of her mouth, and she screamed, multiple voices crying in an agony and rage that rocked me to my core. I ran. I have never felt such blinding terror before, or since. There was no reason, no plan, no strategy to where I was going. I simply threw myself forward into any available empty space that would take me, feet pounding against white wooden floorboards, as I sprinted towards the front of the building. The black door slammed shut as I reached it, and I let out a strangled, helpless cry, trying the knob once before letting go as the door refused to budge. I turned and ran for the stairs, Elia's twisted, shuddering shape making its way towards me in a stuttering half-step. Up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, legs and lungs burning, my eyes watered, and my vision blurred. I heard a horrible crunch as I reached the top of the stairs, and I turned to look behind me. Elia's form had reached the bottom step, and she had fallen forward, catching herself on her arms, limbs lengthening in horrible proportions as she began crawling up each step with unearthly speed, her horribly turned head wobbling back and forth in grotesque fashion. Her mouth was still wide open, still screaming wordlessly at my retreating form, and I turned and sprinted down the dark hallway. The ceiling was high, shadows stretching above me into nothingness. I threw myself around the corner at the edge of the hall, only to find another stretch of hallway in front of me. With Elia close behind, I ran further into the darkness, Elia's enraged screams echoing around me. The rumbling background sound had grown more intense, pulsating through me and vibrating my bones as I bounced off walls and skidded around corners, gasping for breath. No matter how many bursts of speed I put on, how many times I thought I'd lose her, she was soon on my trail again, crawling like some unearthly animal, long legs and arms stretching, snapping forward. I glanced behind me, terrorizing anew as I saw her skid around the corner I just cleared. And as my head turned from the corner of my eye, I saw a glimpse of color. A flash of deep red in the darkness. To my right, down a side hallway, was the red door. I should have questioned it, but there was no time. I hurtled towards it, Elia grabbing at my heels, and I reached out for the doorknob, turning it in an instant and shoving it open. Light poured through the door, illuminating the hallway, and as I turned to slam the door shut, I caught a glimpse of Elia. She was crawling on the ceiling, hands and feet gripping the darkened wood as her face, now right side up because of the angle, hung down almost level with my own. Her mouth split into a wicked grin. Curiosity killed the... I slammed the door shut, leaning against it hard. The door shook violently, rattling against my back. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed harder against it, lips clamped together to stifle my own cries. Go away, go away, go away! After a few moments, the door finally fell still. All sound from the other side ceased. I stood, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, in the golden gilt courtyard we always entered when we stepped through the red door in the past. Impossibly tall buildings rose high above me, glittering in the light of a deep crimson sunset. The air was cooling, but the sparkling bricks and walls around me radiated the ambient heat of a long, hot day coming to a close. Jay, I said hoarsely. Jay, can you hear me? Yes! God, finally! Are you okay? Jay asked. What's happening? You've been babbling nonsense and hyperventilating for the past 5 minutes. I was about to send someone to call 911. Jay, Elia, she's... A rush of hot air tousled my hair, caressing my face. A shadow passed over the courtyard, and I quailed, looking up as a dark shape suddenly dropped down from the air and onto the cobbled pavement in front of me. An owl, huge, almost as tall as me, scrabbled its talons against the gilt stonework. It cocked its head at me once, twice, and then seemed to shiver, shake out its feathers, twitched uncomfortably. And then a woman's head unfurled, standing tall, much taller than me, and the feathers of the owl settling and draping over her body like a fine gown. She folded a pair of wings against her back. Her eyes were impossibly large, nearly filled with luminescent red irises shot with gold, and huge, unchanging black pupils swallowing the middle. Cat? I heard Jay say. What is it? What do you see? Her crimson lips curled into a smile. Her voice was otherworldly, intense, so uncanny that it raised the hairs on the back of my neck the moment she spoke. "I've been waiting for you." "Cat?" Jay's voice whispered. "Cat, what do you see?" "Give me a second," I whispered back. The woman paced in front of me. She seemed to have a hard time sitting completely still. While her eyes remained rapt and focused on me, her head shifted this way and that, at every noise, tilting almost imperceptibly against the breeze. Her wings shifted and ruffled constantly, giving the impression of tireless energy and intense power held at bay. "You are younger than I expected," she said after a moment. "Not yet a woman, but the smell of your blood is much older." Oh, Jesus Christ, the smell of my blood? My knees nearly liquefied. Her presence was crushing, as if I was standing in front of every leader of every major country on Earth, and required to give a speech on a topic I hadn't studied for. I was still pressed hard against the wood door, and refused to move forward into her wingspan. I swallowed, clearing the sudden lump in my throat. I apologize, but I don't know what that means." She seemed to find that funny. "You are truly a youngling, and yet you and the others wander through these expanses with such relative ease. We have watched you ever since you stepped through that door." Her gaze snapped to the red door behind my back, and then back to my face, obvious interest unveiled on her features. "You have something that would be very valuable to many here." I didn't know what to say to that. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she suddenly cocked her head sharply to the side, pupils contracting to tiny pinpoints of black in a sea of red and gold. "It encroaches. Whatever you've done to disturb it, it now presses its influence between the expanses." Her gaze flicked back to me. "You are here to clean up your mess, yes?" I am... yes, that's the goal." I felt absurdly like I'd forgotten something extremely important when talking to her, as if she were in on an inside joke that she expected me to join her in, and yet I didn't know what it was. "It's coming closer." She shook her head, feathers ruffling around her face for a moment, and her wings expanded. "It may know that you're here. I tire of holding this form. But I will give you this, that its door and itself are intrinsically connected. It is a being of gateways, of passages, of in-betweens and not places. What you do to its gateway, you do to itself." She shuddered before I could get a word out, shivered, and hunched forward in an undulating ripple of feathers. The woman was gone, and the owl blinked at me, wickedly hooked beak flashing in the eternal sunset. It flapped its wings in a powerful downbeat, and lifted off the ground, rising higher overhead, before clearing the skyline of buildings, and disappearing, taking off into the twilight. "Jay?" I said quietly when she was gone. "I think I have an idea." "What happened?" she asked. "I'll tell you, I promise, but just bear with me. I may not be able to talk much." I took off in a light run, keeping my eyes peeled for anything that would seem out of place in this red-gold world. Every few moments, a shadow would fall across me, as a dark shape would fly overhead between buildings, like every time before, when we had explored the world behind the red door. I was watched from a distance. I wondered if it were only the owl woman watching, or if there were more like her far above me in the sky. And then, as I reached a wide open marketplace, empty of stalls or beings. I heard it. A low rumbling, with a choppier sound layered over the top. Fuck. It's here, Jay. I don't have much time. I walked out to the center of the empty marketplace, turning in a slow circle, watching the nearby buildings and doors. When I say so, I need everyone in the circle, including you, to picture the green door in your minds. Try not to think of anything else, but just the green door. You got it? Okay, we can do that. But what are you doing? I heard from Jay. Right now, I'm waiting. The noise grew, not louder, but intensified, sending low vibrations throughout my body. The gilt cobblestone beneath my feet seemed to shiver through the bottoms of my shoes, and I kept turning, barely blinking, staring hard into the surrounding architecture. On my third turn in this manner, I saw it. The black door. "Alright," I said quietly. "If I die or go crazy, you guys had better come in and fix this." "No promises," Jay said wryly. I could sense her attempt at humor, but underneath her voice, there was a slight tremble. She was scared. That made two of us. I walked slowly towards the door. It looked the same as it had before, but larger, looming against the backdrop of a glittering golden wall set on the far end of the marketplace. I was a tall girl, and the doorknob was almost as high as my eye level, making me feel like a child again. I turned it and purposefully pulled the door open. The inside of a barn greeted me, heavily obscured in shadows, dead straw and dirt scattering into the darkness ahead of me. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, I was once again in the gray world, color gone, and that distant noise thrumming through my bones. But this time, I turned and immediately shut the door behind me. "Jay?" I whispered. Now do it! The green door!" Come on, you guys!" I heard Jay say. Her voice was muffled and far away, but I heard her, and with that, I pushed the black door back open. The red world was gone, and in front of me were the blanched gray woods, so similar, and yet so different from the woods we had created ourselves. I stepped back outside, heading purposefully into the forest. I had taken a few steps when I heard a deep, heavy thrumming, and glanced over my shoulder back towards the barn. It stood there, in front of the black door. It was tall, much taller than the threshold of the door, and roughly humanoid in shape, but dark, like a hole had opened in the world and had taken on sentient form. The edges of its shape seemed to bend and warp the atmosphere immediately around it. As I stared, the darkness seemed to deepen, and I thought I began catching glimpses of something else. Far behind in the darkness, there began to appear the hints of a shape, or shapes. Shapes with extra edges, with lines and dips and divots and points, in places that made no sense, undulating in unsettling movements only when my eyes looked elsewhere. My stomach churned in a revolting repulsion, my eyes desperately wanting to reject what I was seeing. I felt a tickle of wetness slide down my cheek as I stared, and I reached up to wipe my eyes, my fingers coming away, stained with blood. My head was pounding, my very thoughts squeezing under its heavy weight, and as I stepped back, it seemed to take a step towards me, and then another. Oh, fuck no. I turned and ran, hurtling into the trees. "Jay?" I cried. "Come on, you guys! I need that green door!" She didn't answer. The forest around me kept flickering, shifting in a cacophony of buzzing noises and that deep, rumbling sound. Trees were to my left or right in one moment, and then suddenly in front of me the next, and I had to keep changing my direction. A few times I slammed into tree trunks, scrabbling in a panic against the ground as I regained my footing. I glanced behind me a few times, and always the shadow followed, seeming to never lose ground, but always gaining a little, following steadily behind me. Long limbs moving in disquieting asynchronicity, with the patience and dark purpose of something that is all the time in the world. I felt myself weakening. It was different from getting tired in the physical world. I suddenly felt less, as if I were a canister of water that had cracked and was now slowly spilling my contents out onto the ground around me. My vision began blurring, tunneling at the edges. Nausea overtook me, and I was panting heavily, sweat and a darker liquid sliding down the sides of my face and into my eyes. Its thrumming, deep, bone-cracking sound sunk into my body, and I could feel it squeezing, pressing, emptying. Jay? I whispered weakly, and tripped over a tree root that had suddenly appeared in my path. I hit the ground hard, breath escaping my lungs in a heavy grunt, and I turned onto my back as the shadow closed in around me, reaching ever taller in the sky, its edges rippling like the surface of a puddle that had begun to spread. Jay? I scrambled backwards, and then my hands touched something underneath me, something that felt wholly alien compared to the pine needle-covered ground. Smooth, solid wood, and the shape of a doorknob. I glanced down. The green door had appeared directly underneath my body, lying on the ground. I didn't hesitate, but I gripped the knob hard and turned it, allowing the door to fall open beneath me. I flew downwards, my brain spinning at the shift in orientation, and I landed heavily on the sandy shore of the grotto, sprawling with the green door open in the cave wall in front of me. I could see the gray sky through the door, and as I scrambled to my feet, the dark shadow bent down over the door, blocking out the sky, filling the opening as it tried to reach through. I swiftly leapt forward, grabbed the edge of the door, and slammed it shut in its face. I held it closed for a moment, panting. "If you want me, asshole," I whispered, "you'll have to come in here the hard way." I turned and faced the grotto. It was exactly as we had left it. Gorgeous, luminescent algae made the water glow, while threads of fungus wove a tapestry of green, blue, and purple across the rock walls. The far edge of the underground cavern opened into landscape and sky far above. But what I focused on now was the little camp that had always been at the edge of the water, the tent, and the campfire blazing merrily away in a fire pit dug in the sand. I moved quickly. I knew it would have an easier time pressing into the expanse this time, and I swiftly knocked over the tent, stepping hard on the fabric and pulling up with all my strength, ripping it open. I removed one of the tent poles and snapped it in a similar way, using my weight to bend and break the flexible wood. I quickly bound the shattered pieces together with the shredded tent canvas, and repeated this a few times, until I had at least 4 bundles of wood bound in cloth. A deep rumbling filled the air. I turned to face the cavern wall. In the space of a blink, there was smooth rock wall, and then the black door was there, ominous at its height, a black stain in this beautiful place. I moved fast, my heart pounding. No time to question. Just do what you need to do next. I grabbed one end of one of the bundles and passed the other through the campfire. It took a few tries, but soon the thick wood and bundled fabric caught fire. I looked up as I straightened and noticed that this time it wasn't waiting for me. The door had begun slowly swinging outwards on its own. I approached it quickly, and as it swung open, there it was, standing in a far-off field of gray grass, a stark, black wound against the sky, tall and impossible. It began walking towards me. I held my breath, swung my arms back with all my strength, and tossed the flaming bundle through the door. The last thing I saw through the door was an eruption of white, colorless flame as the bundle landed in that dry sea of dead grass. and immediately caught fire. My eardrums nearly burst at the explosion of sound that reverberated from that fathomless thing, and I gripped the edge of the black door and shoved it closed with all my strength. I wasn't done yet. 2 more bundles went against the base of the door, and the third I lit on the fire just as I had done the first bundle. With my flaming prize in hand, I stalked towards the black door. It rattled and shook. The knob turned furiously back and forth. I carefully bent down and placed the flaming bundle against the others, propping it up so that the fire would have a stable base. I lunged back. The door bowed outward, and an earthly rumbling filled the cavern for a moment, wood screeching in protest. And then, the fire caught and blazed stronger and stronger, finding purchase in the kindling I had provided, and began to steadily work its way up the surface of the black door. A horrible keening ripped through the grotto, and I slammed my hands over my ears and fell to my knees. Rock cracked and split, dust and pebbles falling to the sandy grotto floor, and I curled down into a ball, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the worst. And then, the rumbling slowly went silent. I looked up. I was a lone girl, kneeling in a grotto, watching a slowly growing fire blaze merrily away. I moved, and sat at the far end, pressing myself against the cave wall next to the green door. And I watched it burn all the way down, waiting to make sure. While I sat, I related to Jay and the others what had occurred in the Red World, and how I'd used the campfire in the grotto to, hopefully, destroy the black door. I waited, ready to run if my plan didn't seem to work. But as I watched, the flame seemed to burn brighter and brighter, until finally, the door crumbled in a heaping pile of ash and coals, leaving nothing but a smooth rock wall behind it. I stood, turned to the green door, and cautiously opened it. Lush green woods greeted me. I stepped through, closing the door behind me. I could feel my weariness digging through my mind as I trekked back through the forest, heading in the direction of our all-too-familiar clearing. On the way, I spotted some movement far off between the trees. As I glanced to my left, a beast very similar to an elk, but larger, with dark-tipped horns, and a large staring eye in the middle of its sable forehead, caught my gaze. It inclined its head to the side for a moment, before turning and disappearing into the forest. When I reached the clearing, Elia was there, waiting. I stopped, eyeing her cautiously. She looked like her normal self, wearing the pajamas she had worn Friday night. "Are you actually you?" I asked. She snorted at me. "Do you have any idea what I just went through? Don't be a dick." Well, it definitely sounded like Elia. I walked into the clearing, eyeing her warily. She was not a demonstrative person, but she smiled at me as I approached. "Not bad," she said. "Thanks for coming back." She took my hand. It would have been easy in that moment to mistrust everything I had been seeing, but a part of me needed to believe that we had fixed whatever it was that we had broken. "Jay," I said, "bring us back." I squeezed Elia's hand and closed my eyes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, open your eyes. Elia was back in school the next day. She seemed pale and still a little weak, but mostly herself. She said she didn't remember much while she was sick and was constantly in and out of consciousness with a bad fever. She didn't remember anything about the part of herself that was lost in the Shadow Man's gray world, or coming back with me. but didn't seem overly concerned about it. I think she was just relieved that she wasn't sick anymore, and was eager to put it all behind her, as we all were. We never went out into the woods again, and once high school came around, we all seemed to drift and go our separate ways. I've lost touch with most of my old friends through the years. Some I found again on Facebook, and a few I saw at my high school reunion a few years ago. Everyone seems to be well adjusted in their adulthood, but no one has ever tried anything like Seven Doors again. And currently, no one seems to have any contact with Elia, or know where she is. I've mostly stayed away from any sort of astral projection, lucid dreaming exercises, or journeying type meditations. While I tend towards being agnostic skeptical, I also collect various religious paraphernalia, including blessed Saint Benedictine amulets, one I keep in the house, the other in my car, statues of saints and Vedic deities. Ganesha guards the hallway up our stairs. We have little Jizo statues on the front porch, and sometimes I surreptitiously hide little bowls of salt in the corners of the house. My husband thinks it's quirky, and that I'm constantly questioning everything and demanding proof, but then secretly filling the house with protective charms and statues. Last year, I became pregnant with my first child. I found that I was having increasingly vivid dreams, which is common during pregnancy. But something strange about them made me question what I was really dreaming, and made me think back on this childhood experience. A couple of times, I would dream that I was walking through beautifully sunlit woods, relaxed and comfortable. And though he didn't show up physically as himself, I could feel the presence of my child with me, floating over my shoulder, like a tiny ball of warmth. We would walk for what seemed like hours, taking in the woods and each other's company, never speaking, but feeling each other deeply in a way that I can't really describe. If you've ever carried or given birth to a child, you may know what I mean. During one of these dreams, I remember sitting at the edge of a pond, looking out across the For some reason, I looked down into the water below me, admiring the reflection of the woods in the still, smooth surface. I saw something strange in the far end of the pond, reflected back in the water. Puzzled, I glanced up. Ahead of me, across the water, a large, gray barn stood on the shoreline. The barn was on fire. Alarm and a sudden shock of terror shot through me, and I gasped awake, shaking. My husband woke up, asked me if I was all right, and did his best to settle me down before falling back asleep. I don't knowingly enter any sort of meditation that may take me elsewhere. After that experience, I know better. Maybe we stopped it for a little while. Maybe its connection to whatever plane we were exploring a little weaker. But I know for a fact that what we did won't last. That I'm not forgotten, and that I'm still, 20 years later, being watched. Maybe someday, I'll find a way of severing its connection to me for good. Now, be safe, travelers. And for fuck's sake, if you see it, please never open a black door.